You know that person who almost never explains themselves? They get misunderstood, and somehow they let it happen. Someone assumes they are angry. They do not correct it. Someone thinks they are being distant. They do not send a long paragraph. Someone questions their decision, and instead of defending themselves, they just say, "It's okay," and move on. From the outside, that can look cold. It can look arrogant. It can look like they do not care what anyone thinks. But that explanation is too simple. Because some people are not quiet because they have nothing to say. They are quiet because they already know what it costs to be understood by the wrong person. And once you see that, you can't unsee it. People often misunderstand the person who never explains themselves. They think silence means guilt. If you do not defend yourself, maybe the accusation is true. They think silence means indifference. If you do not clarify, maybe you do not care. They think silence means emotional distance. If you do not open up, maybe there is nothing deeper there. But psychologically, something else may be happening. For some people, explaining does not feel like communication. It feels like entering a courtroom. They do not hear a question. They hear a challenge. They do not feel invited to share. They feel like they are about to prove that their feelings are valid. That matters. Because when someone has learned that every explanation can be twisted, dismissed, interrupted, or used against them later, they stop seeing explanation as connection. They start seeing it as risk. Picture this. They are sitting in a work meeting, and someone says, "You've been really quiet today." Everyone looks at them. They could explain that they barely slept, that they have family stress, that they are mentally exhausted, that they are trying to stay professional because if they speak honestly, their voice might shake. But instead, they smile a little and say, "Yeah, just listening." Later, someone says they seemed disengaged. They see the message. They type a reply. "Actually, I wasn't disengaged. I just had a lot going on." Then they delete it. They type again. "Sorry if it came across that way." Delete. Finally, they send nothing. Not because they do not have an explanation. They have 10 explanations. They just do not want to hand their inner life to someone who may only skim it. That sounds simple until you look closer. The person who never explains themselves often has a very active inner world. They replay conversations. They notice tone shifts. They catch small changes in people's faces. They know when someone has already decided what story they want to believe. So by the time someone says, "Why are you acting like that?" they may already feel tired. Not physically tired, emotionally tired. There is a kind of exhaustion that comes from having to translate yourself over and over again. For many people, this pattern can come from learned independence. Somewhere along the way, they learned that needing to be understood was dangerous, disappointing, or pointless. Maybe as a kid, when they tried to explain their feelings, someone called it an excuse. Maybe when they defended themselves, they were told they were talking back. Maybe when they were hurt, they were told they were too sensitive. So they learned a quiet rule: say less, need less, expect less. And here is where it gets interesting. People often think the person who does not explain themselves has a big ego. But sometimes it is the opposite. Sometimes they are not thinking, "I don't owe anyone anything." Sometimes they are thinking, "Even if I explain this perfectly, it still might not matter." That is the hidden wound in the pattern. They may not be avoiding communication because they believe they are above it. They may be avoiding the specific pain of trying very hard to be understood and still being misread. The strange part is this: people who explain the least are often the ones who have thought about it the most. They have already imagined the conversation. They have already predicted the response. They have already heard the interruption before it happens. They know the moment when a vulnerable sentence turns into a debate. That's the trap. From the outside, their silence looks empty. From the inside, it may be full of calculations. Should I say this? Will it sound dramatic? Will they think I am making excuses? Will they turn this into an argument? Will I regret opening the door? And sometimes, silence wins. Not because silence is always healthy, not because they are always right to stay closed, but because silence gives them one thing explanation does not always give them: control. Control over what stays private, control over how much energy they spend, control over who gets access to their real reasons. But there is another layer. Modern culture makes this pattern even harder. We live in a world where everyone is expected to explain themselves all the time. Why did you leave that job? Why are you still single? Why did you not text back? Why are you not posting? Why did you stop talking to that friend? Why do you need space? Social media turns identity into performance. Dating apps turn personality into a profile. Work culture turns burnout into something you are supposed to manage quietly while still sounding positive. In that kind of world, privacy can start to look suspicious. If you do not explain, people fill in the blanks, and often, they fill them in with whatever story protects their own ego. If you pulled away, you must be rude. If you stopped replying, you must think you are better than them. If you changed, you must have been fake before. If you set a boundary, you must be selfish. But here's the part nobody talks about. Sometimes people demand an explanation not because they want clarity, but because they want access. Access to your guilt, your emotional labor, your vulnerability, your apology. Have you ever felt that someone was not really asking, "What happened?" They were asking, "Can I make you defend your right to feel this way?" That question changes everything, because maybe they are not refusing to communicate. Maybe they are refusing to perform. Maybe they are not cold. Maybe they are careful. Maybe they are not mysterious. Maybe they are tired of being simplified. Maybe they are not punishing anyone with silence. Maybe they are protecting the only part of themselves that has not been negotiated away. That does not mean never explaining yourself is always healthy. Sometimes silence creates distance where honesty could create closeness. Sometimes people who care about you genuinely need context. Sometimes staying quiet becomes a wall, not a boundary. But the deeper question is not, why won't they explain? The deeper question is, what happened to make explanation feel unsafe? Because when you understand that, the whole behavior changes shape. The person who never explains themselves may be carrying an old kind of logic. If I explain too much, I look weak. If I explain too little, I look cold. If I tell the truth, I may be judged. If I hide the truth, I may be misunderstood. So they choose the pain they can control. They choose being misunderstood from a distance over being dismissed up close. That is not random. And if you recognize yourself in this, the point is not to shame you into opening up more. The point is to notice the pattern honestly. When did you start believing that being understood required too much evidence? Where did you learn that your reasons would be treated like excuses? Who made you feel like explaining yourself was the same as asking for permission? And maybe most importantly, who in your life has actually earned the longer version of you? Because not everyone deserves the full explanation, but someone does. The hard part is learning the difference. There is a quiet sadness in people who never explain themselves, not because they do not want to be known, but because they have learned to survive being misread. They can sit in a room full of people and know exactly what they would say if understanding were guaranteed, but it isn't. So they keep the sentence inside, and to everyone else, it looks like silence. But inside, it was a whole story. If this resonated with you, subscribe for more deep dives into the hidden psychology of everyday behavior. And if this felt familiar, you might want to watch the next video on why quiet people notice everything.